Madison Kelly had never heard the word no in her entire life. At 22 years old, she lived in a world where everything was given to her before she even asked for it. Her father, Richard, owned 15 luxury hotels across California, and her mother, Patricia, spent her days shopping on Rodeo Drive and having lunch with other rich wives. Madison's biggest worry was which designer dress to wear to the next party. Every morning, Madison woke up in her pink bedroom that was bigger than most people's entire homes. The walls were covered with photos of herself at fancy events, on expensive vacations, and posing with her collection of sports cars. Her walk-in closet held more clothes than a department store, with shoes that cost more than most people made in a month. She had 3 different credit cards with no spending limits, and she used them all without thinking twice. Madison's daily routine was simple. She would sleep until noon, then spend 2 hours getting ready while her personal assistant brought her coffee and pastries. After that, she would drive one of her 5 cars to meet friends for shopping or lunch. Her favorite car was a bright pink Lamborghini that her father had bought her for her 21st birthday. She loved how people stared when she pulled up, anywhere in that car. But what Madison loved most was taking pictures of herself. She had over 500,000 followers on social media who watched every detail of her glamorous life. She posted photos of her expensive meals, her designer outfits, and her luxury trips around the world. Every day brought new likes, comments, and messages from people who wanted to be her or be with her. This attention made Madison feel important and special. Madison's friends were all just like her. They came from rich families and had never worked a day in their lives. They spent their time going to exclusive clubs, eating at expensive restaurants, and buying things they didn't need. None of them had ever faced real problems or consequences for their actions. When they got speeding tickets, their fathers made phone calls to make them disappear. When they got in trouble at school, their parents donated money to make everything okay. This comfortable life made Madison believe she was untouchable. She had learned early that money could fix any problem, and that her last name opened any door. Police officers knew her father and would give her warnings instead of tickets. Store managers would bend rules for her because she spent so much money. Restaurant owners would give her the best tables even without reservations because they wanted to keep her happy. On the night that would change everything, Madison was celebrating her friend Ashley's 23rd birthday at an exclusive nightclub in West Hollywood. The club was the kind of place where bottles of champagne cost more than most people's rent, and only people with the right connections could get inside. Madison and her friends had reserved the VIP section where they could see and be seen by everyone in the club. Madison wore a silver dress that sparkled under the club lights and cost $8,000. Her shoes were custom made in Italy, and her purse was one of only 10 made in the entire world. She felt like a movie star as people took pictures of her throughout the night. She posted dozens of photos and videos, showing off her outfit, her expensive drinks, and her fabulous friends. As the night went on, Madison drank more and more. She had champagne, cocktails, and shots that her friends kept buying for her. She was having so much fun that she didn't think about how much alcohol she was consuming. In her world, there were always drivers and assistants to take care of practical things like getting home safely. But that night, Madison had given her driver the evening off because she wanted to drive her new pink Lamborghini to show it off to her friends. By midnight, Madison was clearly drunk. She was laughing too loudly, stumbling in her high heels, and slurring her words. Her friends were just as drunk, but none of them thought to call for a ride or ask someone sober to drive. They were all used to doing whatever they wanted without thinking about consequences. When the party started to wind down around 2 a.m, Madison announced that she was ready to go home. Ashley tried to convince her to wait for a taxi, but Madison insisted she was fine to drive. She even took a video of herself walking to her car, telling her followers that she was totally sober and driving like a pro. She posted the video immediately, not thinking about how it might look later. Madison climbed into her pink Lamborghini and started the engine. The car was loud and flashy, just like everything else in her life. She loved the attention it brought her, even at 2 a.m. on empty streets. As she pulled out of the parking garage, she felt confident and in control. She had driven drunk before and never been caught, so she assumed this time would be no different. But Madison's confidence was misplaced. The alcohol had affected her judgment and reflexes more than she realized. As she drove down Sunset Boulevard, she was weaving between lanes without signaling. She was driving too fast and following other cars too closely. Her reaction time was slow, and she was having trouble focusing on the road ahead. Officer Danny Rodriguez was patrolling the area in his police car when he noticed the pink Lamborghini swerving across 3 lanes of traffic. He had been a police officer for 12 years and had seen this kind of reckless driving countless times before. He immediately turned on his lights and siren to pull the car over, knowing that whoever was driving was likely under the influence. When Madison saw the police lights in her rearview mirror, her first thought wasn't fear or regret. Instead, she was annoyed that her perfect night was being interrupted. She pulled over to the side of the road and immediately started thinking about which excuse would work best. She had talked her way out of trouble before, and she was confident she could do it again. Officer Rodriguez approached the car and immediately smelled alcohol. Madison's eyes were bloodshot, her speech was slurred, and she could barely find her driver's license in her expensive purse. When he asked her to step out of the car, she stumbled and nearly fell. It was clear to everyone watching that she was severely intoxicated. Madison tried everything she could think of to get out of trouble. She cried, she flirted, she name-dropped her father's business connections, and she even offered to pay Officer Rodriguez money to let her go. But nothing worked. For the first time in her life, Madison's wealth and status couldn't save her from the consequences of her actions. The arrest had been a shock to Madison, but she quickly convinced herself it was just a temporary problem. Her father, Richard, made phone calls within hours of her booking, and by morning, the family's expensive lawyer, Jonathan Pierce, was already working on her case. Madison spent only 6 hours in jail before her parents posted bail, and she left the police station believing this whole mess would disappear like all her other problems had before. Madison treated the next few weeks like an exciting adventure. She posted photos of herself meeting with her lawyer, calling it her legal drama era on social media. She bought new outfits specifically for court appearances, researching what celebrities wore to their trials. Her followers ate up every detail, sending supportive messages and telling her how brave she was for dealing with such unfair treatment. Jonathan Pierce was one of the most expensive criminal defense lawyers in Los Angeles. He had gotten 3 famous actors out of DUI charges in the past 2 years, and he charged $5,000 per hour for his services. Pierce was confident he could get Madison's charges reduced to a simple fine and community service. After Ciudad, she was a first-time offender from a good family with no criminal history. The lawyer explained to Madison that her case would be heard by Judge Marcus Washington. Pierce had appeared in Washington's courtroom before and knew the judge had a reputation for being fair but strict. He warned Madison that she needed to show respect and remorse during the hearing. Madison nodded and agreed, but she wasn't really listening. She was too busy planning her courtroom outfit and thinking about the photos she would take. On the morning of her court date, Madison woke up early to get ready. She chose a designer dress that cost $4,000, thinking it made her look sophisticated and innocent. The dress was short and tight, more appropriate for a nightclub than a courtroom, but Madison thought it showed off her figure nicely. She paired it with diamond earrings, a matching necklace, and shoes that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Madison's parents drove her to the courthouse in their black Mercedes. Patricia Kelly was nervous about the whole situation, but Richard assured his wife that everything would be fine. He had made generous donations to several judges' favorite charities over the years, and he believed those connections would help his daughter. The family arrived at the Los Angeles County Courthouse expecting a quick hearing and an easy resolution. The courthouse was busier than Madison had expected. There were reporters outside who recognized her from social media, and they started taking pictures as soon as she stepped out of the car. Madison loved the attention and posed for several photos, smiling and waving like she was walking down a red carpet. She didn't seem to understand that this wasn't the kind of publicity most people wanted. Inside the courthouse, Madison was amazed by how old and boring everything looked. The hallways were long and sterile, with fluorescent lights that made everyone look tired. There were metal detectors at the entrances, and security guards watched everyone carefully. Madison had never been in a government building before, and she found the whole experience fascinating rather than intimidating. While waiting for her case to be called, Madison started taking selfies in the hallway. She posed next to the courthouse directory, in front of the metal detectors, and even tried to get a picture with one of the security guards. Other people waiting for their hearings stared at her in disbelief, but Madison thought they were staring because they recognized her from social media. Attorney Pierce tried to explain to Madison how she should behave in the courtroom, but she was distracted by her phone. She kept checking her notifications and responding to comments on her posts. Pierce told her she needed to put her phone away during the hearing, show respect to the judge, and only speak when spoken to. Madison agreed absent-mindedly, but she was already planning the caption for her next post. Judge Marcus Washington had been on the bench for 15 years, and he had seen every type of defendant imaginable. He grew up in a working-class family in South Los Angeles, where his mother worked 2 jobs to support 3 children. Washington put himself through college and law school by working nights and weekends, and he never forgot where he came from. He believed deeply in the principle that everyone should be treated equally under the law, regardless of their wealth or status. When Judge Washington entered his courtroom that morning, he noticed the young woman sitting at the defendant's table immediately. Madison was not paying attention to the proceedings. Instead, she was taking pictures of herself in the courtroom with her phone. Washington had dealt with disrespectful defendants before, but Madison's behavior was particularly brazen. As other cases were called before hers, Madison continued to treat the courtroom like her personal photo studio. She took selfies while sitting in the defendant's chair, posed with her lawyer for group photos, and even snapped pictures of the judge's bench when she thought no one was looking. Court officers repeatedly asked her to put her phone away, but Madison would comply for only a few minutes before pulling it out again. Other defendants and their families watched Madison's behavior with a mixture of shock and anger. Many of them were facing serious charges that could result in jail time or heavy fines they couldn't afford. They had dressed in their best clothes and practiced what they would say to the judge, hoping to show proper respect for the court. Madison's casual attitude toward the proceedings felt like an insult to everyone who took the legal system seriously. The final straw came when Judge Washington was entering the courtroom for Madison's case. As the bailiff announced "All rise" and everyone stood up, Madison saw an opportunity for the perfect photo. She quickly turned around and took a selfie with the judge visible in the background, posting it instantly to her social media accounts, with the caption, "About to beat this case with my amazing lawyer. Justice is served." Judge Washington saw the flash from Madison's phone and watched as she typed on her device while everyone else stood respectfully. He had presided over thousands of cases, but he had never seen such blatant disrespect for his courtroom. The judge's expression darkened as he realized this young woman believed she was above the rules that applied to everyone else. The court reporter stopped typing, the bailiff looked uncomfortable, and Attorney Pierce closed his eyes in frustration. Even Madison's parents, sitting in the gallery, seemed to realize their daughter had crossed a line. But Madison herself remained oblivious to the gravity of what she had just done. She was too busy checking the likes and comments on her latest post to notice the deadly silence that had fallen over the courtroom. Judge Washington took his seat slowly, his eyes never leaving Madison Kelly. In 15 years on the bench, he had seen defendants who were scared, angry, defiant, and remorseful, but he had never seen anyone treat his courtroom like a personal photography studio. The selfie Madison had just taken with him in the background was beyond anything he had experienced, and it showed a level of disrespect that made his jaw tighten with controlled anger. Madison was completely unaware of the storm brewing around her. She was still looking at her phone, reading the comments that were already pouring in on her latest post. Her followers were calling her brave and beautiful, telling her she would definitely win her case because she was too pretty for jail. Some were even asking where she bought her courtroom outfit. Madison smiled as she read the messages, feeling confident that everything was going exactly as planned. Attorney Pierce knew they were in serious trouble. He had warned Madison repeatedly about proper courtroom behavior, but she had ignored every piece of advice he gave her. Pierce had been practicing law for 20 years and he could read judges well. The look in Judge Washington's eyes told him that his usual strategies might not work this time. He leaned over and whispered urgently to Madison to put her phone away immediately, but she waved him off like he was an annoying fly. The bailiff called Madison's case, and she stood up casually, still holding her phone in one hand. Judge Washington watched as she checked her screen one more time before Attorney Pierce physically took the device from her hands. Even then, Madison kept glancing toward where Pierce had placed her phone, clearly more interested in her social media notifications than the legal proceedings that would determine her fate. Prosecutor Maria Santos stood up to present the state's case against Madison. Santos had been a prosecutor for 8 years, and she had prepared thoroughly for this hearing. She began by reading the charges against Madison: driving under the influence, reckless endangerment, and excessive speeding. Santos explained that Madison's blood alcohol level was 0.12, which was 50% higher than the legal limit. As Santos spoke, Madison looked around the courtroom with obvious boredom. She examined her nails, adjusted her jewelry, and even tried to catch glimpses of herself in the reflective surface of a nearby computer screen. When Santos mentioned the blood alcohol test results, Madison actually rolled her eyes, as if the whole thing was a minor inconvenience that everyone was making too big a deal about. Santos then presented evidence that made the case much worse for Madison. Security cameras from the nightclub showed Madison drinking heavily throughout the evening, downing shots in champagne without any concern for how much alcohol she was consuming. The footage showed her bragging to friends about how she never got in trouble for anything because her daddy always fixed her problems. But the most damaging evidence came from Madison's own social media posts. Santos displayed screenshots of videos Madison had taken throughout the night, including the one she posted just before leaving the club. In that video, Madison was clearly drunk, slurring her words as she told her followers she was totally sober and ready to drive like a pro. The timestamp showed she posted this video only minutes before Officer Rodriguez pulled her over. Madison watched the prosecutor present this evidence with growing annoyance rather than concern. She whispered loudly to Attorney Pierce that the videos didn't prove anything and that everyone drinks at parties. Her voice carried across the quiet courtroom, and several people turned to stare at her. Judge Washington made a note on his pad, his expression growing more stern by the minute. Santos also presented testimony from Officer Rodriguez, who described Madison's behavior during the traffic stop. Rodriguez explained that Madison had tried to bribe him, attempted to use her father's name to get out of trouble, and showed no remorse for her dangerous driving. He testified that in 12 years as a police officer, he had rarely seen someone so entitled and dismissive of the law. Throughout Rodriguez's testimony, Madison shook her head and made faces like she disagreed with what he was saying. She whispered comments to her lawyer about how the officer was lying and how unfair everyone was being to her. Attorney Pierce tried to quiet her, but Madison seemed incapable of understanding that her behavior was making things worse for herself. When it was time for the defense, Attorney Pierce stood up and tried to salvage what he could from the situation. He emphasized that Madison was a young woman from a good family who had made a mistake. He talked about her parents' charitable contributions to the community and suggested that Madison had learned her lesson from this frightening experience. Pierce requested leniency, asking for community service and a fine instead of jail time. As Pierce spoke, Madison nodded enthusiastically and gave thumbs up to her parents sitting in the gallery. She seemed to think the hearing was going well, completely missing the fact that Judge Washington's expression had grown darker with each passing minute. When Pierce mentioned her family's charity work, Madison actually smiled and waved at some people in the courtroom as if she was acknowledging applause. Judge Washington had heard enough. During Pierce's presentation, he had watched Madison continue to show complete disrespect for his courtroom and the legal process. Her behavior wasn't just inappropriate, it was insulting to everyone present and to the justice system itself. Washington realized that this case was about more than just drunk driving. It was about whether wealth and privilege could shield someone from accountability. When Pierce finished his argument, Judge Washington looked directly at Madison. His voice was calm, but carried an edge that made everyone in the courtroom sit up straighter. He asked Madison if she understood the seriousness of the charges against her. Madison smiled and said yes, but her tone suggested she thought the whole thing was silly and would be over soon. Judge Washington then asked Madison if she had anything to say for herself. This was her chance to show remorse, to apologize for her actions, and to demonstrate that she understood the gravity of what she had done. Instead, Madison stood up and gave what sounded like a prepared speech about how this experience had taught her to be more careful, but her words rang hollow. She spoke like she was reading from a script, showing no genuine emotion or understanding. As Madison spoke, she actually started to tear up, but they were clearly fake tears designed to gain sympathy. Judge Washington had seen real remorse from defendants, and this wasn't it. Madison's performance was insulting to everyone who had ever stood before his bench with genuine regret for their actions. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Washington prepared to deliver his sentence. Madison stood confidently next to her lawyer, expecting the usual outcome for someone of her background. Her parents sat forward in their seats, ready to write whatever check was necessary to make this problem disappear. Nobody in that courtroom was prepared for what Judge Washington was about to say. Judge Washington stood up from his chair, and the entire courtroom fell silent. Madison adjusted her designer dress and checked her reflection in the courtroom's glass partition one more time. She was certain that within the next few minutes, she would walk out of the courthouse with nothing more than a small fine and maybe some community service. Her father had already prepared to write a check for whatever amount the judge requested. Attorney Pierce felt confident too. In his experience, first-time offenders from wealthy families rarely received harsh sentences, especially young women who could afford the best legal representation. He had already prepared a statement thanking the court for its mercy and explaining how Madison planned to become an advocate for safe driving. Pierce expected to be back in his office by lunch, billing the Kelly family for another successful case. Madison's parents sat in the gallery with relieved expressions. Patricia Kelly had been worried about the media attention, but she was sure her daughter would receive a light sentence that would quickly fade from public memory. Richard Kelly was already thinking about the damage control his public relations team would need to do, but he wasn't concerned about anything serious happening to his precious daughter. Judge Washington looked around the courtroom slowly, making eye contact with Madison, her parents, and the other people who had come to watch the proceedings. Some were reporters who covered celebrity court cases. Others were curious members of the public who had heard about the rich girl who took selfies in court. Everyone expected the same outcome that always happened when wealthy defendants appeared before judges. When Judge Washington finally spoke, his voice was clear and firm. He began by explaining that the court had heard all the evidence and considered all the arguments from both sides. He talked about the seriousness of drunk driving and how it put innocent people at risk. Madison nodded along politely, thinking this was just the usual lecture judges gave before announcing minimal punishments. But then Judge Washington's tone changed. He said that what troubled him most about this case was not just the drunk driving, but the complete lack of respect Madison had shown for the legal system and for public safety. He mentioned her behavior in the courtroom, her social media posts, and her apparent belief that rules didn't apply to her because of her family's wealth. Madison's smile began to fade as she realized the judge was criticizing her personally. She looked confused, as if she couldn't understand why anyone would have a problem with her behavior. Attorney Pierce started to look nervous, sensing that something was going wrong with what should have been a routine sentencing. Judge Washington continued speaking, his voice growing stronger with each word. He said that the court had a responsibility to ensure that justice was equal for everyone, regardless of their bank account or social status. He explained that Madison's actions showed a dangerous disregard for the law and for other people's safety, and that her behavior in his courtroom proved she had learned nothing from her arrest. The judge then announced Madison's sentence, and the words hit the courtroom like a bomb explosion. 60 days in county jail with no possibility of early release, 200 hours of community service at a homeless shelter, a $10,000 fine, 1 year suspension of her driver's license, and finally, complete surrender of all phones and social media devices for the entire duration of her sentence and community service. Madison's face went completely white. For several seconds, she couldn't speak or move. She looked around the courtroom as if she was waiting for someone to tell her this was all a joke. When she realized the judge was serious, she started shaking her head frantically, saying, "No, no, no," over and over again. Attorney Pierce immediately stood up and asked for a recess to discuss the sentence with his client. Judge Washington denied the request and made it clear that the sentence was final and would be carried out immediately. Pierce tried to argue that the sentence was too harsh for a first-time offender. But Judge Washington cut him off, saying he had heard enough arguments for one day. Madison finally found her voice and started crying loudly. These weren't the fake tears she had used earlier in the hearing. She was genuinely terrified and shocked. She had never spent a night away from her luxury bedroom, let alone 2 months in jail. The idea of being separated from her phone and social media accounts was almost as frightening to her as the jail time itself. Patricia Kelly gasped and covered her mouth with her hands. She had expected her daughter might receive a few days of community service, not 2 months in jail. Richard Kelly's face turned red with anger, and he started whispering urgently to his assistant about appealing the sentence and finding a way to get Madison out of this situation. The courtroom erupted in surprised voices and shocked whispers. Reporters immediately started typing on their phones and laptops, knowing this story would be front-page news within hours. Other defendants waiting for their cases looked amazed that a rich person was actually being punished like everyone else. Madison begged the judge to reconsider, promising she would do anything else he wanted. She offered to pay a bigger fine, do more community service, or make donations to charity. She even suggested that her father could build a new wing on the courthouse if that would change the judge's mind. But Judge Washington remained unmoved by her pleas. Deputies approached Madison to escort her into custody, and she became hysterical. She screamed that this wasn't fair and that her father would sue everyone involved in her case. She tried to run toward her parents, but the deputies gently but firmly guided her toward the door that led to the jail. Attorney Pierce promised he would file an appeal immediately, but Judge Washington had already made it clear that Madison would begin serving her sentence right away. As Madison was led away, still crying and protesting, she looked back at her parents one last time. For the first time in her life, she realized that her father's money and influence couldn't save her. She was going to jail like any other criminal, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The courtroom slowly emptied as the shocking sentence sank in. Some people were pleased that a wealthy defendant had finally faced real consequences for her actions. Others thought the judge had been too harsh on a young woman who had made a mistake. But everyone agreed that nobody had expected this outcome. Within hours, Madison's sentence was the top story on news websites and social media platforms. The girl who had lived her entire life in the spotlight was about to disappear from public view for the next 4 months, learning lessons that no amount of money could have taught her. Madison's first night in county jail was the worst night of her life. The orange jumpsuit they gave her was rough and uncomfortable, nothing like the soft designer clothes she was used to wearing. Her cell was tiny and cold, with concrete walls and a small window that showed only a brick wall outside. The bed was a thin mattress on a metal frame, and the pillow felt like it was stuffed with rocks. Her cellmate was a woman named Lisa, who was about her mother's age. Lisa had been arrested for writing bad checks to pay for her daughter's medical bills. Her little girl had cancer, and Lisa couldn't afford the treatments even though she worked 2 jobs. When Lisa learned why Madison was in jail, she shook her head in disbelief. She couldn't understand how someone with so much money could be so careless with other people's lives. Madison cried for hours that first night. She had never been away from her phone for more than a few minutes, and now she felt completely cut off from the world. She didn't know what her friends were doing, what people were saying about her online, or even what time it was without constantly checking her device. The silence was almost unbearable for someone who was used to constant notifications and messages. The food in jail was terrible compared to what Madison was used to eating. Instead of expensive restaurant meals and gourmet coffee, she got bland sandwiches, watery soup, and coffee that tasted like dirty water. She lost weight quickly because she could barely stomach most of what they served. Her perfectly manicured nails broke from the rough soap and harsh conditions, and her expensive hair treatments grew out, leaving her looking ordinary for the first time in years. Outside the jail, Madison's story had become huge news. Videos of her being led away in handcuffs were played on television stations around the country. Social media was full of debates about whether Judge Washington had been too harsh or if Madison deserved even worse punishment. Some people praised the judge for treating a rich person the same as everyone else, while others said the sentence was unfair for a first-time offender. Madison's parents hired the best lawyers they could find to appeal the sentence, but every court they approached upheld Judge Washington's decision. The appeals court said the sentence was within legal limits and that the judge had acted properly. Richard Kelly was furious that his money and connections couldn't help his daughter, but there was nothing he could do except wait for her to serve her time. During her second week in jail, Madison started talking more with Lisa and other inmates. She heard stories that shocked her about people who had lost their homes, couldn't afford medical care, or had been arrested for stealing food to feed their children. These women weren't evil criminals like Madison had always imagined. They were regular people who had made desperate choices or simple mistakes that had serious consequences. One woman named Carol had been arrested for shoplifting baby formula because she couldn't afford to feed her newborn son. Another woman named Betty had been caught driving without a license because she needed to get to work, but couldn't afford to pay old traffic tickets. Madison began to realize that most of the women around her were in jail because they were poor, not because they were bad people. After serving her 60 days, Madison was released to begin her community service at a homeless shelter downtown. The shelter was in a part of the city she had never seen before, where the buildings were old and broken and the streets were full of people with nowhere to go. Madison's job was to serve meals, clean bathrooms, and help sort donated clothes. It was the first real work she had ever done in her life. The people at the homeless shelter were different from anyone Madison had ever met. There were veterans who couldn't find jobs after coming back from war, families who had lost their homes. When someone got sick, and elderly people whose Social Security checks weren't enough to pay rent. Many of them were educated and had worked good jobs before bad luck changed their lives. Madison met a man named George, who had been a teacher for 30 years before losing his job and his house in the same month. She met a woman named Susan, who had lived on the streets since her medical bills bankrupted her family. These people weren't lazy or worthless like Madison had always believed homeless people were. They were struggling with problems that couldn't be solved with money alone. As weeks passed, Madison found herself actually caring about the people she met at the shelter. She started listening to their stories and trying to help them in small ways. She learned how to cook simple meals for large groups and how to organize donations efficiently. For the first time in her life, she was doing work that helped other people instead of just making herself look good. When Madison finally completed her community service and got her phone back, she was a completely different person. Her social media accounts had gained millions of new followers during her absence. But instead of posting selfies and luxury items, she started sharing stories about the people she had met. She used her platform to raise awareness about homelessness, poverty, and the problems facing working families. Madison's first major decision after getting out was to sell her pink Lamborghini. She used the money to create a scholarship fund for students from low-income families who wanted to go to college. She also convinced her father to donate space in one of his hotels to house homeless families temporarily. Her parents were amazed by the changes in their daughter, who had become thoughtful and caring instead of selfish and shallow. The media attention that had started as negative publicity became positive as people saw Madison's genuine transformation. She appeared on television shows to talk about her experience and what she had learned. She was honest about how spoiled and entitled she had been, and she encouraged other wealthy young people to think about how they could help others instead of just helping themselves. Judge Washington followed Madison's story in the news and was pleased to see that his unusual sentence had worked. He had taken a risk by giving such a harsh punishment to a first-time offender, but he believed that sometimes tough consequences were necessary to create real change. Madison's transformation proved that justice could be about rehabilitation and education, not just punishment. Years later, Madison became known as an advocate for criminal justice reform and support for underprivileged communities. She never forgot the lessons she learned during those difficult months, and she used her privileged position to help people who didn't have the same advantages she had grown up with. The spoiled rich girl who had once taken selfies in front of a judge had become someone who actually made a difference in the world.